Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Burch. I am a philosophy lecturer at the University of Essex, and my research focuses on phenomenology, and I do work at the intersection of phenomenology and the social and cognitive sciences. So today, what I want to talk to you about is a very interesting sort of philosophical question. It's an ancient question that's been given a kind of contemporary spin in recent work. It's a question about the true self, right? And there has long been acknowledged a kind of, a kind of puzzle about the true self, right? A kind of question about what the true self really is. So this is the outline for our discussion. First, I'm going to introduce the puzzle, like what is the puzzle about the true self that I want to talk about. Then in the second section, I'm going to talk about some recent work in experimental philosophy that covers this topic. Experimental philosophy is a new branch of philosophy that uses the methods of psychological experimental science to address often traditional philosophical problems. And then in the third section, I'm going to talk about a kind of new solution to the puzzle of the true self, or a relatively new solution. Okay, so the puzzle. What is the puzzle? The puzzle is famously sort of discussed in this paper by Maria Scheckman. That's her in the corner there. Paper called Self-Expression and Self-Control. And in that paper, she says, look, it's very commonplace that people sometimes are not themselves, right? That's something that you hear often. Typically, or at least very often, you hear this when the usual mechanisms of self-control are compromised. So for example, when a person has had too much to drink, or when a person is really deprived of sleep, they might do things that are kind of uncharacteristic forms of behavior. And people will say, oh, well, that's, he didn't really mean it. He was just had too much to drink and he sort of lashed out. Or she didn't really mean that. She's just very tired. And so that's why she said that thing. So the idea is reason isn't sort of running the show. And so these sort of uncharacteristic expressions come out of the person, right? Expressions and intentions that don't reflect the agent's so-called true self. But on the other hand, right, you also see that these are precisely the circumstances under which it's often said that people are most fully themselves or reveal their true natures. So, there's a famous expression, in vino veritas, when you're drunk, you tell the truth. And so it's this kind of interesting puzzle, like where does the true self lie? Is it in those moments when we're really in control and we're acting in light of what we think we ought to do? Or at those moments when we really are not in control and our sort of deep inclinations come out. And what you find is that these really two different philosophical conceptions of the self underwrite each interpretation of these different moments. So on the one hand, there's this philosophical view that's been around forever. It's a view really strongly associated with Plato, this idea that the true self, the agent that you really are deep down, is the one who exercises rational control over his or her behavior. So to be yourself is to exercise this kind of rational self-control. And on the other hand, you have this view that what the self really is this deep set of natural and robust desires or inclinations. So to be yourself is to express these robust desires. And so you see this kind of view often is associated with figures like Nietzsche and also with philosophical period of Romanticism. Okay, so you have these two conflicting notions of the self that underwrite these intuitions, these everyday intuitions about expressions of the true self. Okay, so if we were in a classroom right now at this point, I'd ask you to raise your hand just to sort of gauge your intuitions. Like, do you think that the true self should be attributed to the things that are sort of expressive of reason? Or do you think that the true self, the self that you are deep down, is really reflected by your desires, right? And I would try to get you to make a choice, right? So you might not feel like either one is correct, but I'd try to get you to make it a choice at this point, see what your intuitions were. Now, we're on to the second part of the talk, right? So now I want to talk about this recent work in experimental philosophy that's trying to sort of explore this puzzle a little bit, right? And so part of their work is motivated by psychological research, and psychologists for a very long time have found this robust, strong body of evidence that shows that people tend to distinguish the true self, right, the person you are really deep down, and a false self, right, or a superficial self. So the idea is, it's not that these selves actually exist. Psychologists, most of them, don't think that there is, in fact, a true self. What they're studying is just what people say. And what they find is that, by and large, people, and not just in Western cultures, but people across cultures, tend to say, yeah, there's a true self, and then there's kind of a superficial one, one that isn't really reflective of who you are deep down. Okay, and so this work in experimental philosophy is trying to bring these two traditions together, this tradition of different philosophical accounts of the sort of true nature of the self, with this psychological research showing that people do in fact think that there is such a thing as the true self, right? So the question they ask, and this is a paper that I have the reference for there, right, by Newman, Bloom, and Knobe, right? The question they ask is, can we reduce this true-false self dichotomy to the reason-inclination dichotomy? So those two views, right? So the self deep down is reason, or the self deep down is desire. Can that map on to this distinction between a true and a false self that we see in psychology, right? So the question is the true self reason and the false self desire? Or is it the other way around? And that's the question they want to explore. And again, they're not trying to say that there is such a thing as the true self. They just want to know, what is it that people think? Do people think that the true self is reason, or do they think that it's desire? Okay, so they decided to study this in a kind of experimental setting. So what they did was they took 200 undergraduates and they divided them into two groups, right? So they did an experiment with two conditions, right? And in both conditions, each group of students is going to read a vignette, a short story describing Mark, right? And Mark is a person who is experiencing a kind of inner conflict. Okay, and in one condition, a condition that they describe as the anti-gay belief condition, Mark is described this way. So Mark is an evangelical Christian who believes homosexuality is morally wrong, but he feels sexually attracted to men. So you see the tension there is dividing Mark's personality over his belief, which is associated with his rational judgment, and then his feeling, right, which is associated with his desires. So there's that condition. And then the other condition is called the pro-gay belief condition. Now, in this case, you have Mark experiencing a different tension. In this case, Mark is a secular humanist, right? He doesn't have any religious commitments, and he believes that homosexuality is morally permissible. He has no problem with it, right? His belief is that it's perfectly fine. But he feels, right? He has these feelings of disgust when he thinks about homosexual relationships. Okay, so again, you have that same tension. There's this kind of division between what he believes and what he feels. And you flip them in the two different scenarios. And the idea is you want to see if people's intuitions flip too about which one of these things represents Mark's true self. Now, there's an interesting detail in this study. With these 200 people that they brought into the study, they asked them before the study, are you a Republican or are you a Democrat, right? So this study was done in an American university. And the reason they did this is because when you ask someone if they're a Republican or a Democrat in the United States, it's a good way to gauge what their stance on homosexuality is. Republicans, by and large, think that homosexuality is morally wrong. Democrats, by and large, will say that it's fine, right? That there's nothing morally wrong with it, right? So they're trying to identify an association that I'm going to show you in a minute by asking this question. Okay, so after they've done that, they do the actual experiment. And what the experiment consists of is asking the people who read these vignettes, which mental states reflect Mark's true self? Is it his belief or his feeling, right? So people in both conditions are being asked this question, okay? And the idea behind this whole experimental setup is that these different views of the self will predict different outcomes for this experiment, right? So if the self is generally thought to be our rational self-control, if we think that the self is deep down is our reason, then both groups, both conditions should identify Mark with his beliefs, right? Because those are beliefs he's arrived at through deliberation. So if he thinks it's wrong, they should identify him with that belief that it's wrong. If he thinks it's right, they should identify him with that belief. If the other view is correct, that the self deep down is the expression of our robust inclinations or desires, then they should identify the true Mark with his feelings. So you should be able to see a switch, right? If they think it's his feelings, then in condition 1, they'll identify him with his attraction to men. And in condition 2, they'll identify him with his aversion to same-sex relationships. So what did they actually find? Well, the results were not at all what those theories would predict. Okay, so you have condition 1 on the left side of your screen. So this is the condition where Mark thinks homosexuality is wrong, but he's attracted to men. So what they found was that liberals or Democrats identified Mark's true self with his feeling, right? So they identified him with his feeling, namely his attraction to men. Whereas conservatives identified him with a mixture of those things. So they identified Mark's true self with his belief that it was wrong, but also his feeling, right? So, and that's just the dominant group. So those were the dominant associations. And then in the second condition, where Mark believes that homosexuality is totally fine, but he feels a kind of negative affective response to it, the liberals, the Democrats, identify him with a mixture of his belief and his feeling, whereas the conservatives just identify him with his feeling. So what you see is not at all predicted by the different theories, right? The results. So the takeaway from this experiment with respect to, can we reduce the true false self dichotomy to the reason desire dichotomy, is that no, we can't, right? Neither rational control nor our natural inclinations or our desires are consistently identified as the true self, right? So what does, right? What does serve as the basis of true self attributions, right? So if we can't identify the self with reason, or if people tend to not identify the self with reason, and they tend to not identify the true self with desires, how does this work, right? How can we explain these experimental results? So another possible explanation, one that I'm quite partial to myself, takes a different kind of philosophical anthropology, a different view about the nature of the self and the nature of human life, right? So this view is one that is heavily influenced by the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, in particular his famous work Being and Time from 1927, and then also a much later work by Harry Frankfurt, an American philosopher who published this book in 1988, right? And what they argue is that the true self is not to be identified with reason or with desire, but rather something else entirely. So here's a person here, let's just say this is me, right? And I have some things in my life that are of central importance to me, things that I really care about, right? My kids, my marriage, my profession, my friends, right? And on the other hand, I have these other things that are in my life that are not as important to me, but they matter to me to a certain extent, and I will carry out actions to try to, fulfill my obligations in those domains and so on. But these other things, these things that are represented at the core of myself, those are the things that are deeply important to me, that matter to me most. And on this care-based view is these things, right? We call these our cares. These are the things that centrally define me, right? Taken together, these things constitute my deep self. On the other hand, right? Okay, so my deep self is my fundamental practical standpoint. And on the other hand, there's these things on the periphery of the self, and that's the superficial or false self that people talk about in that psychological literature. Okay, so this changes things. So if X is a care, right, and constitutes part of my deep self, then it'll have the power to shape my motivations, my emotional attachments, my beliefs, my commitments, and my deliberative judgment. So you can see where this is going already, right? So the true self is not my belief, it's not my desire. The true self is the things that I care about, and those things that I care about shape all these other things. And hopefully, so I'll make it clear where exactly how this applies to the experiment, right? So the idea is Mark's conflict is not between his true self and a false self. Rather, it's a conflict between different elements of his deep self, a conflict between competing cares, right? So it's a conflict between things that he cares about, not between reason and desire. Okay, so condition 1, right? So this is the condition where Mark's an evangelical Christian. He believes homosexuality is wrong, but he's attracted to men, right? And so 2 of his sort of cares are deeply involved in this tension, right? On the one hand, he has this identity, right? He cares about being an evangelical Christian, but on the other hand, he has a certain sexual orientation, and that matters to him too. Okay, so why do we get these results then? The idea is that in condition 1, the liberals are identifying him, right? They're saying what he really cares about is his sexual orientation, right? So we can represent Mark's conflict this way, right? His sexual orientation, that's really his deep self, but outside of, and his evangelical Christian commitments kind of lie outside of that deep self, right? So that's kind of what they're saying about the vignette. And the conservatives, on the other hand, are identifying Mark with both, right? They're saying, no, his evangelical Christian identity is important to him, but also so is his sexual orientation, right? So it's not a combination of belief and desire, but the conjunction of two significant things that he cares about. Okay, so this is how conservatives think of Mark's condition. Now, in Mark's conflict in the second condition, Mark, just to remind you, Mark's a secular humanist who believes homosexuality is morally permissible, but he feels disgust at the thought of same-sex couples. Right, from this point of view, what we have are two competing cares, right? His secular humanism, right, and the moral judgments associated with that. He cares about those. On the other hand, he also has this abiding care about his sexual orientation and the fulfillment of that orientation. Okay, so when the liberals interpret his behavior in condition 2, they identify what he, they attribute his secular humanism and his sexual orientation to his true self, right? So if they were to depict him as an image, they would put both of those cares in his deep self there. On the other hand, the conservatives only identify him with his sexual orientation in this case. And they say deep down, that's what Mark really cares about. His secular humanism is on the outside of his deep self, but his deep self is this other care, this commitment to fulfillment of his sexual orientation. Okay, so the upshot of this is we don't identify the true self with reason or emotion, belief or feeling, but rather with the things we care about. Okay, so now's an opportunity for you to ask me any questions that you might have.